You think you're overreacting until your son removes you from his wedding guest list and then calls you crying from his honeymoon suite. I'm a 69-year-old mother who spent 40 years teaching my son about loyalty, only to be uninvited from his wedding 3 weeks before the ceremony because his fiancée decided I wasn't good enough. What happened at that altar while I sat home alone changed everything, and I have no regrets about how I handled what came next. Let me be absolutely clear about what happened. My son Daniel uninvited me from his wedding because his fiancée Ashley said my presence would ruin her perfect day. She told him I was too plain, too old-fashioned, too embarrassing to be in her wedding photos. Daniel agreed with her. He called me 3 weeks before the wedding and said I shouldn't come. Then, 40 minutes into the ceremony, his phone started ringing non-stop because Ashley's father stood up during the vows and announced their marriage was a fraud designed to access my son's inheritance. Daniel called me from the altar, begging me to fix everything. I hung up on him. I raised Daniel completely alone after my husband walked out when Daniel was 2 years old. I worked as a seamstress for 38 years, taking alterations and custom orders from my basement to pay our bills. I sewed prom dresses at midnight and hemmed suits at dawn. I taught Daniel that character mattered more than appearance, that loyalty was everything, that you judged people by their actions, not their income. I watched him grow into a thoughtful young man who seemed to understand what really mattered in life. Then he met Ashley 6 months ago and became someone I barely recognized. Ashley came from money, real money. Her family owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states. She wore designer clothes and talked about winter homes and country clubs. Daniel was dazzled immediately. He started changing how he dressed, how he talked, what he valued. He'd been working as a middle school history teacher, a job he loved. But suddenly, he was talking about switching to sales or finance, something that paid better, something that would impress Ashley's family. I met Ashley twice before the engagement. Both times she looked at my home with barely concealed disgust. She commented on my furniture being outdated. She asked if I'd ever considered renovating. She suggested Daniel and I didn't seem like we came from the same background, which was her polite way of saying I seemed poor and he'd somehow risen above it. Daniel laughed along with her observations like they were charming instead of cruel. I told myself she was just young, just sheltered, that she'd warm up once she knew me better. The engagement happened fast. 4 months after they met, Daniel proposed with a ring that cost more than I made in 6 months. Ashley said yes immediately and started planning a wedding that sounded more like a corporate merger than a marriage. Guest list of 300. Destination venue. Professional photographers. Designer dress. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be impressive. Everything had to prove they belonged in her family's world. Daniel asked me to be involved in the planning. I offered to help however I could. Ashley smiled tightly and said she had a professional coordinator handling everything, that I shouldn't worry about it. Every time I asked about details, about what I could contribute, about my role in the ceremony, the answers got vaguer. Finally, Daniel admitted that Ashley wanted a small, intimate wedding party. Just her sisters as bridesmaids, just his college friend as best man. No parents in the processional, no mother-son dance, no speeches, just a clean, elegant ceremony focused on the couple. I understood immediately what was happening. Ashley was editing me out. Not because of anything I'd done, but because of who I was. A seamstress who lived in a small house with outdated furniture wasn't the kind of mother-in-law who photographed well for her social media announcements. I asked Daniel directly if Ashley had a problem with me. He said no, that I was being sensitive, that Ashley just had a specific vision for her day. I asked him when my presence became something that needed to be managed rather than celebrated. He said I was making everything about me when it should be about them. 3 weeks before the wedding, Daniel called. His voice was strained and uncomfortable. He said he needed to talk to me about something difficult. Ashley's family had reviewed the guest list and the venue had capacity issues. They needed to cut some people. Several distant relatives weren't coming anymore. Some of his college friends had to be uninvited. And me! I wasn't coming either. I asked him to repeat that. He said Ashley felt strongly that the wedding should be immediate family only. And since I'd never really connected with her family, since I didn't fit the aesthetic they were going for, since my presence might make things awkward in photos and at the reception, it would be better if I stayed home. He said they'd do a nice dinner together afterward, just the three of us, something casual where we could celebrate privately. He said he hoped I'd understand. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I asked him one question. I asked if he was seriously uninviting his mother from his wedding because his fiancée was embarrassed by me. He said I was twisting his words. He said this wasn't about embarrassment, it was about creating the right atmosphere. He said Ashley had worked so hard on planning everything and he couldn't let me ruin it by being difficult. I told him I'd never been difficult, that I'd offered nothing but support, and that if he thought his mother attending his wedding would ruin anything, then he'd already chosen which relationship mattered more. I hung up. He texted me an hour later saying I was being unreasonable, that I was making this harder than it needed to be, that he was still my son, and I should want him to be happy even if that meant making small sacrifices. I didn't respond. I blocked his number. I sat in my sewing room surrounded by decades of memories and understood with absolute clarity that my son had traded his values for a woman's approval and a lifestyle he thought he deserved. The wedding was on a Saturday afternoon in October at an expensive vineyard 2 hours away. I know this because Daniel's cousin texted me the details along with an outraged message about what Daniel had done. Apparently half the family knew I'd been uninvited, and most of them were disgusted. Some of them considered boycotting. I told them not to. I said Daniel had made his choice and they should attend if they wanted to. I wasn't going to create more drama. That Saturday, I went to my sewing room and worked on a quilt. I'd started it years ago, piecing together fabric from Daniel's childhood clothes, his baby blankets, his school shirts. Pieces of the life we'd built together. I worked slowly and carefully, trying not to think about what was happening 2 hours away, trying not to imagine my son getting married without his mother present. My phone rang at 2:30. Daniel's cousin, she was whispering frantically. Something had happened at the ceremony. Ashley's father had stood up right before the vows and made an announcement. He said he couldn't let the wedding continue without revealing the truth. Ashley had lied to Daniel about everything. She wasn't in love with him. She'd researched him deliberately after learning he was set to inherit a significant trust from his grandmother, my late mother-in-law, when he turned 35. Ashley had targeted him specifically because she needed money. Her family's business was failing. They were drowning in debt. The car dealerships were a facade. They needed Daniel's inheritance to save themselves. My cousin said the entire venue erupted. Ashley started screaming at her father. Daniel just stood there frozen. Guests were pulling out their phones. Ashley's mother fainted or pretended to faint. The coordinator was trying to clear the room. Then Daniel's phone started ringing, over and over. He wasn't answering. It was me calling, except it wasn't. It was everyone trying to reach him, but his phone showed my blocked number on the screen somehow. The chaos was complete. 20 minutes later, my phone actually rang. Daniel. I stared at the screen. I let it ring through to voicemail. He called back immediately. I answered. He was sobbing. He said he needed me. He said everything had fallen apart. He said Ashley's father had destroyed the wedding. He said he didn't know what to do. He said I was his mother and I had to help him. I asked him very calmly why he thought I would help him. He said because I was his mother, because family was everything, because he needed me. I said family was everything 3 weeks ago when he uninvited me from his wedding because I was too embarrassing for his fiancée's photos. I said loyalty was everything when I raised him alone and taught him values he'd abandoned the moment a woman with money paid attention to him. I said he'd made his choice about which relationships mattered and now he had to live with those consequences. Then I hung up. He called back 16 times. I didn't answer. He left voicemails begging me to call him back, saying he was sorry, saying he'd made a mistake, saying he needed his mother. His cousin texted saying he'd left the venue and was driving around crying. Ashley had disappeared with her family. The wedding was cancelled. Guests were leaving confused and gossiping. It was a complete disaster. I felt nothing but cold clarity. My son had betrayed me for a woman who'd betrayed him. He'd chosen social climbing over integrity. He'd uninvited his mother from his wedding to impress people who were using him for money. Now that it had all collapsed, now that he'd been humiliated and exposed and abandoned, he wanted me to fix it. He wanted unconditional maternal love to erase the consequences of his choices. That evening, Daniel showed up at my house. I watched him through the window. He was still in his wedding suit, wrinkled now, his tie loose. He rang the doorbell. I didn't answer. He knocked. He called my name. He said he knew I was home. He said please. He sat on my porch steps for 2 hours. I watched him from my sewing room window. Finally, he left. The next morning, he came back. This time, I opened the door. We stood there on opposite sides of the screen. He looked exhausted, destroyed. He started apologizing immediately. He said he'd been an idiot. He said Ashley had manipulated him. He said he'd gotten caught up in her world and lost sight of what mattered. He said he was so sorry for uninviting me. He said he loved me and needed me to forgive him. I told him I heard his apology. I told him I understood he'd been manipulated. I told him that didn't change what he'd done. He'd looked at his mother, the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise him, and decided I wasn't good enough to attend his wedding. He'd chosen a woman's opinion over 33 years of love and loyalty. That decision told me exactly how much I was worth to him, and an apology after that decision backfired didn't undo the revelation. He said he'd been wrong. He said he'd make it up to me. He said he'd do anything. I asked him what he thought making it up looked like. He said he'd bring me flowers. He'd take me to dinner. He'd make sure I knew how important I was to him. I told him those were gestures, not accountability. I told him I didn't need flowers from a son who'd been ashamed of me. I told him the damage was permanent. He started crying again. He said I couldn't mean that. He said mothers forgave their children. He said I was all he had left now that Ashley was gone. I told him I'd been all he had before Ashley arrived, but that hadn't stopped him from discarding me when it was convenient. I told him I'd spent 33 years being enough, and I wasn't going to beg him to see my value now that his other options had disappeared. He asked what he was supposed to do. I told him he was supposed to live with his choices. He was supposed to understand that actions had consequences. He was supposed to learn that people weren't disposable. I told him when he genuinely understood what he'd done, not just that it backfired, but why it was wrong in the first place, then maybe we could talk. But I wasn't going to comfort him through consequences he'd earned. He left angry that day. He said I was being cruel. He said he'd been humiliated enough without his own mother punishing him. He said I should be grateful he wanted a relationship with me at all after everything that had happened. That sentence told me everything. He thought I should be grateful. He thought his willingness to reconcile was a gift I should accept eagerly. He still didn't understand that he'd revealed something about himself that couldn't be unrevealed. 2 months have passed. Daniel has called a few times. The conversations are brief and surface level. He tells me about looking for a new apartment, about going back to teaching, about trying to rebuild his life. He doesn't mention Ashley, he doesn't mention the wedding, he doesn't ask deep questions about how I'm doing or acknowledge the specific harm he caused. He wants to move forward without actually addressing what happened, and I won't allow that. I'm 69 years old. I spent my entire adult life working in a basement sewing room to give my son opportunities. I taught him that integrity mattered, that loyalty was sacred, that you protected the people who loved you. When he abandoned those values, when he decided I was too embarrassing to include in his life's important moments, he didn't just hurt my feelings. He showed me that everything I'd taught him was negotiable if the price was right. Some people think I'm being too hard on him. They say he was manipulated, that he's learned his lesson, that I should forgive him and move on. Maybe they're right that he was manipulated. But being manipulated doesn't excuse uninviting your mother from your wedding because she's not impressive enough. It doesn't excuse choosing a woman's aesthetic preferences over your own mother's presence. Those choices revealed something true about who he'd become, and manipulation doesn't erase that truth. I haven't changed my will. Daniel is still my beneficiary, but I've made it clear that inheritance doesn't equal relationship. He'll get my house and my savings when I die because he's my son, but he doesn't get my daily presence, my emotional energy, or my unconditional acceptance while I'm alive. Not until he genuinely understands what he destroyed and why it matters. My sewing room is quiet these days. I still take alteration jobs. I still work on my quilts. I have friends from church who check on me. I have my cousin who calls weekly with family updates. I'm not abandoned. I'm not broken. I'm just a mother who learned that sometimes your child becomes someone you don't recognize, and loving them doesn't mean accepting how they treat you. If Daniel comes back truly changed, genuinely understanding not just that he made a mistake, but why that mistake was unforgivable, I'll listen. But I won't pretend the wedding that happened without me doesn't matter. I won't pretend being uninvited from my son's life because I wasn't impressive enough was just a small misunderstanding. Some wounds don't heal just because the person who caused them is finally sorry. I sleep peacefully now. The quilt I'm making from Daniel's childhood clothes sits unfinished in my sewing room. Maybe one day I'll complete it, maybe one day he'll deserve it. But right now, it's a reminder that the child I raised and the man he became are two different people, and I'm allowed to mourn that loss while still protecting my dignity. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done in this situation? And do not forget to subscribe to Golden Years Diary for more stories like this.